judge, it doesn't mean to distinguish. So when you see this word in judge, and we're going to see it today, this is a very important word. P-H, or yeah, the P-H-E-C-H, P-S-E-C-H-E. Psuche. Psuche is a word that's psyche. And if you remember, we got to remember this. The three parts of a body, of a being, in Greek thought. Mind is what? Mind is psuche. Psuche. Mind is psuche.
Body.
Body? Body is sarx. Sarx. And what is the soul? Is pneuma. So in Greek thought, the body is three pieces. In Hebrew thought, how many parts to the body? Two. Psuche and sarx. The Greek thought, though, the body, and by the way, Pharisaic thought, the body is made of three parts too. And our thinking, modern thinking, New Testament thinking, Christian thinking is the body is three parts also. But it's very interesting, the word psuche in our text is translated life. Because it can mean life, because it's the breath, in Greek thought it's the breath of the body, but it is the mind. That's why psyche comes from psuche. And finally, zoe. In this case, zoon, but zoe. Zoe is also translated life in our text. This is the problem with Greek. Greek is very complex, very concrete, very specific. And just like the number of words for say and sev, the number of words for love in Greek, I can translate them all love. But if I'm talking about romantic love, which is the romantic love eros, and you think I mean desirous love, which is pathos, or if you think it's agape, which is only the love of the gods, which is a paradox, right? Because no human can love with agape, or phileo, which is what you have love for people. Okay, there are 10 or 12 of these words. Epithumia, etc., sturgeon. If I translate all those words as love, which love am I talking about? The same is true of life. If I'm talking about psuche, and I translate it as life, and I mean zoe, and if you don't know that, you're going to have an issue. So let's look at the text. Matthew's a 5-part argument. I don't have time to go into great details today about that because we've already talked about it, but in any case, let's go to the last thing we looked at was be perfect, therefore, as your Father in heaven is perfect. What is that, 5:48, I think? Mm-hmm. So chapter 6. So he finished the section of the law, and he moves on to a section about diakosune. It says, okay, we're talking about law. We still have not cut off the law. The law is still implied here. We're talking about the law. The law will never end. That's what Christ said. So the next part he gets to, he says, be careful not to do your acts of diakosune, of equity before men to be seen by them. If you do, you'll have no mythos, pay for services from your Father in heaven. Okay, so the whole point is the kingdom of heaven is coming, right? Remember, put that in front of every single statement. The kingdom of heaven is coming. And so now he says, don't do your acts of equity. So acts of equity is very different. If I say acts of righteousness, which is a mistranslation of the Greek, that's really different than if I say acts of equity. What's an act of equity?
Justice.
Yeah, justice. Matter of fact, the word diakosune, dia means justice. Dike means justice. That's where the word comes from. So justice or equity. Matter of fact, remember we said diakosune can mean don't eat too much, don't eat too little. Don't drink too much, don't drink too little. The Greeks would worry about someone who is doing too much. The Greeks would say, in fact, the Hebrews do too. The Hebrews have a law. The Talmud says you can't give over a certain amount of your income. I think it's 15%. Because they view that, what does it mean if you're giving too much of your income to charity?
Well, either you're bragging or you're not taking care of your own.
Yeah, the Talmud specifically addresses this. Do you see the Greeks would think the same way? The Greeks would say, if you're giving too much to charity, there's something wrong. You're not taking care of who you're supposed to take care of. Matter of fact, the saying, charity begins at home, you know, might have been, could be a Greek, I don't know where it came from, but it could be a Greek saying. Because their point is, what do? Equity in all things. And I'm not advocating that you set a limit necessarily. I mean, pastors would be upset with that, but, you know, others. I'm just saying that, you know, in ancient cultures, it is a known kind of idea that if you go overboard this way, as a matter of fact, okay, you're not going to know this unless you've been reading the book I've been blogging. But what is that sin called? Or not sin, the lust, the desire, the temptation called that we're talking about here. The temptation to go overboard. Either way.
No one's reading your book.
No one's reading my book. Luxuria. It's usually, we translate it lust, but it's luxuria in the Latin and luxuria in English. Luxuria is the sin, the temptation, where you can't, you know, you've got to have the newest clothing. You've got to have the best food. You've got to have, you know, in great, you know, not, if you eat or drink in great amounts, it's not luxurious so much. Luxuria is the sin that makes you desire to have the 1954 champagne, which is probably flat anyway, right? See? Right? But if you drink it to excess, that is the lust or temptation of drunkenness. If you eat too much, it's gluttony, right? But if you, but you have to have the desire. So luxuria is that specific temptation or sin we're talking about in historical thinking. But the ancient cultures tended to recognize this. We do too, but we call it what, greed, or we have, you know, we basically kind of, you know, if you're ostentatious, right? You know, people that are too ostentatious, whatever, so you know what I'm saying. We have the same kind of feeling within our culture, we just don't talk much about it. But if you look at the Greek culture, you know, this idea of diakosune. So for example, don't do your acts of righteousness, your equity. Now equity, justice, or let's say equity, just eating or drinking too much or too little. Now this is interesting. Does this mean you're supposed to do your excess hidden away? Already we're getting a paradox here, aren't we? Think about these words. These are pretty complex words he's talking about. But if you don't act in a way that's equitable, see, already we are getting something that is really kind of complex. In other words, specifically, the actions of religion are not what he's asking for. He's asking for the actions of what? Diakosune. Diakosune. The balance of equity. So then it goes on, it says in 2, so when you give to the needy, and remember this is elosune, so it's compassionateness. It's not necessarily, it's not really needy. It's when you are showing compassion to another person. And that is, there's that balancing, I don't have time to get into it. Remember when we looked at this word, it said it was a word that means compassion that you would want to be shown to you under certain similar circumstances. Do not announce it with trumpets. Okay, this is very important. How do you announce with trumpets?
Okay, someone comes before you.
No, not really. The trumpets are, anytime you see trumpets mentioned in the New Testament, unless it specifically says that it's a musical instrument, it's the trumpets in the temple. The trumpets were well known. The trumpets were places to give your alms, to give your money in the temple. They were shaped like trumpets, like this. They had a small opening. We don't know if they had a small opening at the top or a small opening at the bottom. They could have been like this, but it's where you put your money. Okay? So like those rolling things, you put your money in, right? They roll around and roll around. So we don't know if they were small at the top. Some commentators think they're small at the top and big at the bottom. Some think they're big at the top and small at the bottom. But when you went into the temple, you would throw your money into the trumpets. And when you put it in, what would happen?
It'd make a noise.
It'd make a sound. Bing, bing. And you remember the mite? The widow's mite? She put in 2 mites. They're not mites, they're leptons. What are leptons made out of?
Wood.
No. Wood didn't have any word. They're made of iron. Leptons are made of iron. Remember I told you, there's no way they would have nailed people with iron nails to a cross because somebody would steal the iron. They would use pegs made of wood because wood's cheap. Iron lepton, what happens when I put a piece of iron in a brass sounding thing like this?
Resonant frequency.
Well, it goes bonk, right? Bonk. If I put a piece of copper in, it would go bing, or a piece of gold, bing, right? I put a lepton in. So people ask, how did Jesus know she put in 2 mites? Everybody knew she put in 2 leptons, because when she threw them in, they went bonk, bonk, see? And all these rich guys are putting in their money. It's like, remember the one-armed bandits, right? When you take the money out, bing, 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 you know, all the money, you know, that's what we're talking about here. And so when you see this, it says, so when you give to the needy, don't announce it with trumpets. Okay, where did the money from the temple go? The money placed in the trumpets went where? To the priests. They went to the temple. Do you see the paradox here already? Because the money that's put in the trumpets don't go to the poor anyway. See? Do not announce with trumpets as the hypocrites do in the synagogues. And already he's going to tell you who he's talking about in a second. In the synagogues and on the streets.
Which explains why they're hypocrites. They're claiming to give to the poor by throwing it in the trumpet to begin with.
Where are they not giving it though? Well, where? They're not giving it in the streets. Do you get this? They're not giving in the synagogue and the streets. They're taking it to the temple and putting it in the trumpets. Because why? When you put it in the trumpets, everybody knows. See? This is beautiful Greek. It's cultural Greek. It's telling you something very deep. And literally the streets aren't streets. It's crowded alleyways. The rumen. The crowded alleyways. Where people don't go. Do you see this? He's making comparison with synagogues and on the crowded alleyways. To be honored by men, I tell you the truth, they have received their mithros, pay for services in full. It goes on. When you give to the needy, your elesume, your compassionateness, there's no word in English for that, it's okay. Don't let your left hand know what your right is doing. Okay, is it possible for your left hand not to know what your right hand is doing? No, unless you cut them off.
If you're in your right mind.
Do you see this? This is a paradox. He's making a statement that's impossible. It is impossible to not let your right hand know what your left hand is doing. But yet, in a perfect sense of equity, he's telling you that's what you have to do. In other words, he's telling you, can you do these things? No. No. You can't do these things. You can never achieve. Remember, he who pines after equity, diakosune, will be filled to bursting. In other words, we'll never find it. This message keeps going. It's really an interesting message. So in your giving, your compassion is, let it be kryptos, concealed. Then your Father who sees what is done in the kryptos, concealed, will, mithros, will pay you for the services. In other words, equity of being means it is done how? Anonymously, secretly. Well, you know, anonymous is probably too strong a word because, but yeah, anonymous is cool. But I'm just saying, that may be too strong a word because I don't think he's saying, he is saying don't take pride in being, because remember that word for compassionateness means that what may you need?
You may need compassion.
You may need the same thing. Do you see? So, you know, when you're giving, you know, if someone was giving to you because you had need, and by the way, remember what he said. When you give, how are you supposed to give? This is what Jesus said. As a loan. As a loan. Right? Remember? He said, give to who asks, but he said, give it as a loan. You know, we miss that part. It's straightforward in the Greek. So what is he saying? He's saying, when you're giving to the needy, what are you giving the needy? A loan with the expectation that they will return the diakosune. Because you know, this word that's used, eleisune, in the Greek means an equitable kind of compassion. This is really different than our normal way of thinking about this.
When they return it, is it supposed to be to you or to another person in need?
Well, you know, if you want to play the pay it forward, and the Greek thought would probably be to anyone, because it's a compassionateness. In other words, you may have that need, but somebody else, like Dave has it right now, so I'm going to give him a loan, and then that loan will pay it back. So he's going to pay it back to me. So Jesus Christ is already talking about this pay it back thing that people have been playing about, you know, for you know, whatever, since the movie came out, I don't know. But
it may not be